Okay, hope that helps. We'll continue. We have plenty of time for more questions. I want to continue with the next part, the most difficult one, as I promised. I hope to keep you awake for the next 30 or 40 minutes. This is one of my favorite topics, complexity thinking. I'll start with a story again. Dave Snowden is a complexity researcher from Britain, and he speaks at plenty of agile conferences. Some of you might have heard of him. And he is very much into complexity thinking, as I am, though he's far smarter than I am. But whenever he is on stage, he starts attacking systems thinking. Ha! Systems thinking, that's so old-fashioned. They think that you can have a goal and simply do your best and then you will achieve it. That's not how it works in complex systems, he said, because the goal emerges in the system. You cannot predefine it. Well, I know John Seddon is another keynote speaker, and he was in the room once, and he calls himself a systems thinker. He was furious. He was mad. How dare he talk like that about systems thinking? That is not at all what systems thinking is. And then John Seddon, when he is on stage, I saw him last at a Lean Kanban conference. When John Seddon is on stage, he starts attacking Lean. I hate Lean. He said literally, this was at a Lean conference. So you can imagine what the response was of some people in the audience. He said, wherever I go, when they introduce Lean, the organizations fail. And they said, this is not Lean what he's talking about. He is misrepresenting it. He is drawing a caricature out of it. But then these Lean practitioners, the Kanban crowd, whenever they are on stage, they start attacking Agile and Scrum. They say, well, Agile is focusing on the team. It is sub-optimizing at the team level. While Lean, of course, addresses the whole organization. It is much better. Well, this tends to annoy the Agile people, I can tell you. They say, well, this is not what Agile is about, because Agile exists at all levels. It doesn't matter if you're Agile as a team or at top management, whatever. So that drives them nuts. But I know these Agile practitioners, because I've been around it for a few years, and when they are on stage, they start attacking project managers. Because project managers have these Gantt charts, and they try to predict the whole future with their Gantt charts, and they have this command and control approach to projects. Well, there's a blog by Glenn Elliman, who is a project manager for NASA and the Department of Defense in the US, and it drives him insane. He says, this is bad project management that you are talking about. Good project management is what you call agile. So, again and again, the keynote speakers and the bloggers and the writers, they disagree with each other over the words, over the formulations, and it's a lot of fun, I can tell you. I participated in it as well. But this is how we make sense of the world. And it all starts with reductionism, because we have these conversations, these disagreements, because we care about abstractions. And they are imperfect. They are not complete. But we need to talk about things in an imperfect way. There's no other way of doing it. So this is called reductionism. We reduce the whole complexity of the universe to simple words, to simple terms. And then we get into a fight, because we have different meanings of the different words. And the ones who love doing that most are what I would call the left brain thinkers. Now, I have it among quotes, because left brain versus right brain is bad science. Dave Snowden hates me for it, that I use left brain versus left brain versus right brain, but because he hates it, that I keep using it, because it annoys him, and I like that. So left brain thinkers, they are the engineers and the scientists, and they are typically the ones who create all these models for organizations. All that business process reengineering, theory of constraints, Six Sigma, etc. All left brainers who do that kind of stuff. They are the ones who love creating models for things, including organizations. But that leads to a problem, Because, well, a number of problems actually, and the first one is dehumanization. When we have all these models, we don't see anymore that we're actually working with human beings, because we're looking at models. That's more fun than, oh, these fuzzy people behind them. So the numbers in spreadsheets are interesting. That's the executive problem, we could call it. They don't realize that they're working with human beings anymore. Another problem is that some think that they can objectively design human systems. Like maybe we should wire these two departments together and have things flow from here to here and then change and tweak this a bit, and then things will work better. But there is no such thing as an objective observer in social systems. Everyone is subjective. So I would call that the consultant's problem, where they think that they can objectively look at an organization. Then we have the architect's problem, who are in their ivory towers creating these models and handing them down to the people in the workplace, who then have to work with them. But the models make no sense to those people. They have not created the models themselves. They don't know how to use them. And, well, of course, some project managers have this need to try and predict the future, to try to anticipate all the possible risks out there. That is a problem in some cases. And sometimes it leads to blame cultures, because when people have too simple explanations for things, they think that whenever something goes wrong, somebody must have done it. And there's a problem here. Somebody must have done something wrong, otherwise we would not have this problem. Who did it is then the first question. It's very, very typical. So, and by the way, me separating all these issues in dehumanization, objectivization, etc., this is another reductionism problem here that I am now committing, right? I'm reducing that complexity to something very simple. So we all do this, including me. Now there are other people who want to go the other way, and this is called holism. We could call them the right-brainers, revenge for the right-brainers. And for example, Peter Senge, who wrote The Fifth Discipline, a very famous book, he said living systems have integrity. Their character depends on the whole. And he actually talked in his book about the soul of organizations. Well, that is where you lose some of us, and including me, because what exactly is the whole? How do you define the whole? You would need the whole universe, the multiverse, to discuss every single problem. It makes no sense. So if everything is connected to everything, then how do you limit the whole? Well, Donella Meadows is a systems thinker, and she said, actually there are no systems. It is just what we want them to be, how we define it, that we draw a boundary somewhere and then we say, oh, this is a system. That is how we discuss problems, and it depends on the kind of questions that we want to ask. So again, there is a middle road, and again, I will point out that complexity is that consensus between the two, complexity theory. What is complexity theory? Well, according to this quote, it does not embrace that radical holism of systems theory, the notion that everything matters. No, you have to reduce it in some way, but it's also not reductionism. It is somewhere in between. Examples: brains, bacteria, the internet, immune systems, cities, etc., etc. They're all complex adaptive systems, according to the scientists. They're complex because they are somewhat hard to predict how they're going to behave. Well, usually we know what they're doing, but sometimes they surprise us. And they're adaptive because they change to their changing environment. The same is true for a software team. They are complex adaptive systems. Everyone agrees with that so far, because they are slightly unpredictable and they adapt themselves to the environment. Now, complex is different from complicated. These two words are often used interchangeably, and that's understandable, but the scientists see them as two very, very different things. For example, Here you see the three different kinds of systems, where the ordered ones over there on your left, on my right, yes, they're the ones that we construct ourselves. We create them and we know exactly how they work. They're totally predictable. The anarchistic ones are on that side. We do not know how they behave. We cannot predict their nature. Like the stock markets, by definition, are unpredictable. Otherwise, all of us would be making lots of money. So they are unpredictable. The ones that are interesting are the ones in the middle. They are the complex ones, slightly unpredictable. That's the stuff that we're focusing on right now. That is different from things that are complicated. Complicated means how hard is it to understand how they work. Like a software team takes just a few beers or cocktails later on to get to know everyone. That's all it takes, basically. A few stand-up meetings, 360-degree, whatever. That's not very complicated. The city of Shanghai, where I was, that is rather complicated. But both of them are complex systems, so complexity is the nature of the system. And complicated is how long does it take us to understand them. Different things. And sometimes people mix them up. Now, there are many theories over the last 100 years. Plenty of theories have been devised, like chaos theory, social network theory, what do we have more? Game theory, evolutionary theory. When we join them all together, we get this ugly looking body of knowledge with many theories not fitting together right, but it is alive and kicking. And when we apply them to the complex adaptive ones, we call it complexity theory. But there's actually no such thing as complexity theory. It's just everything we know about systems applied to those complex adaptive ones. We call that complexity science. And it's quite hip. It's quite hot in the last 10 years or so. This is a quote that I picked up from one of the books. Complexity theory is about the dynamics of change in a system. I told you to remember the Agile Manifesto. The fourth line of the Agile Manifesto, responding to change over following a plan. Another quote, it is a new theory of business that places people and relationships into dramatic relief. Individuals and interactions over process and tools. The first line in the Agile Manifesto. Both quotes are from before the Agile Manifesto, the end of the 90s, these texts were written. So it is no surprise that Dave Snowden says, basically complexity in Agile is like a marriage made in heaven. It's the theory that explains why it works. It is the scientific laws that explain why Agile works. So it makes sense. And Stephen Hawking, you probably know that name, he said early in this century, he said, at the end of the last century, he said, the next century will be the century of complexity. It's like the third major wave in science after Newtonian and Einsteinian physics. So it is pretty hot. Well, that's all fine, I hear you thinking, but what can we do with it? Okay, well, a few ideas. First, I want to talk about models briefly, and then about complexity thinking. What is this? A paper plane? No? Yeah, paper plane? No? Drawing? What? Stitching. Yeah, the stitching of a paper representation of an airplane. Yeah, so it's a model of a model of a model. I love it. Yeah. So models are all around us. And these models are simply our representations of real things, our descriptions of what we see around us. And I have lots of examples here, 2 different models for continuous improvement. The one on the right is the good old PDCA cycle, 70 years old. The one on my left is the learn, build, measure. Yeah, learn, build, measure, from the lean startup movement, quite hot these days. More or less the same thing, different models. Another, making sense of learning, Shu Ha Ri. The Chinese thought it was hilarious when I showed this, by the way, because these are Chinese pictures, Chinese letters, but Shu Ha Ri is Japanese. So they thought that was funny. I don't get Chinese humor. But anyway, Shuhari, that is for some that in the audience they're familiar with it, the levels of learning. Well, there are others also. The Dreyfus model of skill acquisition is another model also for learning. It lists five levels. Different models about the same thing. There are different models about complexity. There are different models about everything. But one criterion that I think is very important is the model has to help people make sense of the world. It is sense-making that it's all about. So the question is always, is this model helping you to make sense of what is happening around you? If not, it's a bad model. That is the most important criteria. And there are plenty of bad models out there, actually. Is this a good model of London? Well, it depends what you're using it for. It could be a fine model in some cases. In other cases, it's a bad one. This is a very complicated model of London. Again, it could be fine depending on what you're using it for. A simple model for projects, Scrum. A complicated model for projects, Prince 2. Doesn't it look terrifying? Well, I'm not saying it is a bad model. It is simply a model that, well, depends on the context, how useful it is for you. A simple model for managers. A complicated model for managers. From another book about complexity and management. So I'm not saying this is a bad one, it's simply more complicated. What's this? Petit Nicolas, yes. I was just talking about it earlier today. This was our attempt at getting to know the French language. When I was in school learning French, we did that with the books of Petit Nicolas. For children, and that was our model of the French language. So models are never perfect. They have to make sense to the people who use them. And in the end, all models are wrong. Some are useful, as George Box famously said. It is context dependent. Now, and I think this is a key point, because all these models will fail at some point. They all fail. You will need multiple of them. You will need multiple models. It's just like in social network theory, they talk about the strength of weak ties, as they call it, where they say that all the weak ones in the social network are together stronger than the few strong ones. They've noticed that with the Arabian Spring in various countries in the Mediterranean Sea. Because all the weak ones together are stronger than the few strong ones. Same with models. All the models fail, but a few models together, they give you a pretty good view on the world outside. So, how should we use those models in the social system? Now we get to complexity thinking. This is about trying to apply these ideas from science, from the systems theorists, to management of organizations. How can we do that? Well, this is complexity thinking as I see it. Dave Snowden hates me for it, because of course he has a different view. But I say that's the point of being a complexity thinker. We all have different views. Together it makes sense. All right, this is the first one. It sounds a bit silly. You have to address complexity with complexity. What? Well, that means if a system is trying to survive in a complex environment, it has to be at least as complex as the environment in which it is trying to survive. That makes a bit of sense, perhaps. Because if it is not as complex as the environment, at some point it will die. It will not be able to deal with the changes anymore that are out there. So various suggestions and can be derived from this. For example, the human mind is far more complex than any tool or technology out there. Our brains are vastly more complex than any other tools that we use in projects. So we have to rely on the human brain in order to fix problems, and not on the rational unified process documentation or whatever. Because that is merely complicated. It is not complex. Same with using stories and metaphors and pictures, because the scientists say this triggers the complexity of the human mind. It taps into into that complexity. And actually, this is a very important law called the law of requisite variety, the required variety of systems to survive. And some said that this is the most important law for business, as important as Einstein's law of relativity. That's quite something. For example, suppose you have a Kanban board and it has a lot of sticky notes and columns and swim lanes and all kinds of things attached to the sticky notes, and there are a few people standing around it and discussing it. Which part has the requisite variety, or which part has the complexity to deal with a complex environment? What do you think? Does anyone know how this part of the Kanban board with a few people around it, which part of it is the most complex? The people. Yes. And what happens is that many people get lost in discussions about the Kanban board. How to make it better, more columns, more swim lanes, more complicated. Oh, we have more problems that we're trying to deal with in the environment. Maybe we need more Kanban boards. Maybe we need networked versions of Kanban boards. I have one that I suggested that myself. But those are all complicated solutions, not complex. The complexity is in the brains of the people. They are the ones who solve the real challenging problems. So that is what the scientists mean. The complexity is in the people's heads. Another example, evaluating people. This happens in many organizations in the following way. As a manager, you get this form from the HR department, and you are expected to rate individual team members on their performance. And this person gets an 8, and this person gets a 7, or whatever, and then perhaps even their salaries depend on it. Does it make sense? Well, from a science perspective, absolutely not. It is ridiculous. It is not tapping into the complexity of the system. What makes more sense is 360-degree evaluations, for example, because only the whole system can evaluate itself. So you ask people to evaluate each other, and you collect that input, and you turn it into something that is more able to deal with that complexity, instead of one manager assuming that he has all the knowledge. I did that, by the way, in quite an innovative manner. I invited my team members for dinner. We had a team of 5, so that was relatively small. We had dinner, we had the HR forms next to our dinner plates. We had a discussion about it, like how do you think Timo scores in code quality? I think it sucks, somebody said. Well, I think it's great. And then we had good discussions, and then we rated each other. And it was one of the most useful nights I had that year. We were a respectful and trusting team. Of course, that's a requirement. But it was useful, and we filled out the forms. I signed them and I shipped them off to the HR department. That's how you can do it. I tapped into the complexity of the system. This quote I should have showed you earlier, perhaps. The narratives that Ralph Stacey refers to, the things that we discuss in stories that are important for sense making. That's why we often use storytelling. Trying to make sense of the world. Part 2, I have 6 suggestions for complexity thinking. This is the second one. Use a diversity of model. Complexity itself is anti-methodology. It is against one size fits all, said Tom Petzinger in his book on complexity and management. Because we need multiple weak models. Each single model will fail. Scrum itself will fail, but Kanban will also fail. And many other methods will fail. We know that. So why not try and make sense and use multiple models? Because together they make a stronger model. So I am very much anti-dogmatic. I hate it when people say, this is not Scrum, you're doing it wrong. Well, that's for me to decide if I'm doing it wrong or not. Because I prefer to use a diversity of models. So we need many different people and tools. We need different metaphors and analogies. We need different practices and patterns and simulations, perhaps. As an example, I once researched intrinsic motivation. What does that mean, intrinsic desires? Well, I found this one, Stephen Rice's list of 16 basic desires. Acceptance, physical activity, curiosity, etc., until tranquility, order, and vengeance. Then another one, self-determination theory by Decky and Ryan. They have a different opinion. They say it is relatedness, autonomy, and competence. Okay. Then there's a very popular book by Daniel Pink. He said, in his book Drive, he said it is about purpose, autonomy, and mastery. Okay, also fine. By the way, he cheated because he said this was based on self-determination research, but that was relatedness, autonomy, and competence. So he changed relatedness for purpose. I don't know why. Competence is mastery. I would see that that is equivalent, but relatedness, I don't see how that is purpose. Anyways, who cares? They're all useful models. And we shouldn't take our models too seriously because we should use multiple of them. I actually mixed them into my own model. I like that. So I stirred them together. I call that the mojito method. I stirred them together and then came up with something new. And now I have the champ frogs model because the initials spell champ frogs. I have no idea what champ frogs is, but it is the champ frogs model. So use multiple models. That is useful, I think. Third one, things have to depend on context. Best practice is past practice, as Dave Snowden said. What works for you in the past may not work for you in the future. Sometimes they call it retrospective coherence. So after the fact, you can explain why something was successful or why something didn't work. But you can never predict it, because things will turn out differently. But then when things happen, it all makes sense. And you think, yes, now I understand why this was a success or why it was a failure. Like, I got married a year ago. We had, of course, a fantastic wedding. People are still talking about it. I know behind the fact why it was a successful wedding. I could not have predicted it. And if we had the same location, same people, same music, etc., I still could not guarantee that we had a similar great wedding. It depends. Maybe next time the building will fall apart, or the weather will be terrible, or anything could happen. I do a game in my courses. I call it Meddlers for unrevealed reasons. It consists of hexagonal tiles, and we create team structures. So I give people the assignment, come up with a number of teams, Scrum teams, and they have this amount of customers, this amount of projects, and what will the business unit look like? And then they play with structures, and they ask me sometimes, Jurgen, is this the right solution? And then my answer, I don't know. I have no idea, because it depends on your context. And I do not know what kind of organization you have. You use your own assumptions, your own imagination. So could be, maybe it is terrible structure. You will have to figure it out for yourself. Fourth one, assume subjectivity and co-evolution. I often explain this as follows. Last year when I was on vacation in Mongolia and China, somebody said, I could never live in China. And I said, well, of course not, because you were not born and raised in China. China tends to produce the kind of people who like living in China. The United States tend to produce the kind of people, they're called Americans, they love being in the United States. So this is the whole point of having a culture. I'm quite sure many people in France like being in France. It's the people form the culture form the people. It is co-evolution, as we call it. And same with systems, other systems. The observers influence the system influences the observer. Many consultants don't realize that. I'll give you an example. In my course, I use this feedback door, or happiness door as I call it. So after lunch or at the end of the first day, I ask people to give me feedback with sticky notes on a door. 5 means very happy, 1 means I'm glad to be out of here. It could also be somewhere in between, and they can write something on the sticky notes. And of course, one reason for doing this is to get feedback earlier, shorten the feedback cycle. Another reason for doing this, they may not realize it, but I am influencing the system this way. I'm pretending to measure. What I'm really doing is I create a funny looking information radiator, and they can put sticky notes on the door. Isn't this a great course? Voila, the sticky notes go up already by just having a door to put sticky notes on. This is co-evolving. And that's important. They also call it sometimes reflexivity with a more difficult word. So the observer influences the system, sometimes intentionally. I told you about me sitting with teams every now and then. I attended stand-up meetings and I attended planning meetings. I was aware that as an observer, I was influencing what was happening there. Because as a complexity thinker, I understand what I'm doing. I'm not just watching and observing. No, I am making them aware that I'm sitting there, not saying anything. And I hoped it had a positive effect on the organization, and I think it did. So I sometimes call it proximity management. Change your position, move your ass around. It is, I think, the best decision I have made in the past, because when I just started out as a manager, I had, of course, my own desk that was twice as big as anyone else's, and I had a computer that was twice as fast as the software developers had. Of course, I only did Microsoft Word, but at least it was twice as powerful. And things were not really going that well, I have to admit. And then later I learned, that might be because I was too far away from them. I didn't know what was going on. So in the next business where I worked, I moved my desk and I sat among the software developers. And this made all the difference. I was more one of them. All right, fifth one. Anticipate, adapt, and explore. We are very good at anticipation. Daniel Dennett is a philosopher, and he said, basically, human beings have this anticipation device in their heads. We are quite good at predicting the future. We're so good at it that we got addicted to it. We use too much anticipation, and this is where Agile came in. With Agile, we said, let's cut down on the anticipation a little. It's like alcohol. It is useful in small doses, but not too much. You can only enjoy it if you anticipate the next sprint, or maybe two, but that's about it. Don't go too far. So these are two of the three kinds in which systems survive in complex environments. It turns out there's a third, which is exploration. That is not anticipating, because you don't really know if you're going in the right direction. This is not adapting, because the environment is not asking you to change. No, you just explore. You do something because you can. No idea what this will look like, but let's find out. I ordered a chai tea latte at Starbucks a few weeks ago. I hated it. I threw it away. It was terrible. I will never do it again. But, well, I didn't know until I tried. So that was typical exploration. I think sometimes we lack exploration in agile organizations, where all the focus is on anticipating the next sprint and then adapting to the requirement changes by the customer, and then anticipate the next sprint again, on and on. By the way, this is also experimentation. Those 7 levels of authority, if I have managers try and figure out how far to go delegating stuff, if they go to the next level, they have no idea if that is good or not, but they can experiment in a safe-to-fail way, as the scientists sometimes say. Another suggestion: FedEx days. I like that idea. Atlassian, a tool vendor in Australia, came up with it. They let people experiment for a day, and everyone at the same time in the whole organization does something that they like doing, and the only requirement is that they deliver something within 24 hours. That's why they call it the FedEx days. You deliver something in 24 hours. And you show the results to your colleagues. It can be anything, some kind of tool concept you created, some kind of mock-up of a website or whatever. As long as you learn something by experimenting. I very much like that idea. So we need more experimentation. Last part, develop models in collaboration. Because, as I said earlier, the models have to make sense to the people who use them. If you get a model for somebody else, like an architecture that somebody else handed down to you, or some kind of big process that is unified and created up front, and you will have to use it, that makes no sense. The model has to be created by you in your interaction with the environment. So An example of that I showed you earlier is that moving motivators exercise, where the point is not really the pictures on the cards, because people can use other words if they want. The point is to get discussions, to get people talking about what is in their brains. And this is simply an enabler. Of course, as I said earlier, this is just my perspective on what I think it means to be a complexity thinker, to use those ideas from science that I picked up here and there in the books. One example, and then some final words, and then we wrap up this second part. I wondered by myself, does Scrum match complexity thinking? Is that something that we would do as complexity thinkers? The first one, are we addressing complexity with complexity? Yes, certainly, because we invite the whole team for the stand-up meetings. The whole team has to be present in the planning and the demo meetings, because we need all their brains to discuss problems, also with the retrospectives. So that is addressing complexity with the power of the wisdom of the crowd on the team, so to speak. Number two, is it using a diversity of models? Well, to be honest, if I look at what Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland are writing, that there's one good way of doing Scrum, they even defined it to, they updated their official definition just a few months ago. There's one good way of doing Scrum, the rest is Scrum but, they call it. Yes, you're doing Scrum, but you're not doing stand-up meetings. Or yes, you're doing Scrum, but you're not ending every sprint with a retrospective. Those are Scrum buts. So I would say, well, that's one model. That's your suggestion. Not different models. Assume dependence on context, certainly, because they present it as a framework. So they expect you to plug in all kinds of other practices that depend on your context. Makes sense. Is it co-evolving? Certainly is, because with the retrospective and the demos for customers, we get feedback, then we use that feedback, then we do something else. This will influence the customer, it will influence the product owner and the Scrum Master, and this goes on and on. Is it anticipating, adapting, and exploring? Well, I have discussions about that with people. If I simply look at the official definition of Scrum, I would say I don't see experiment or explore anywhere there. Just anticipate the next sprint, adapt to what the product owner demands. Then anticipate and adapt. So I would say you need to make a bit of time for experimentation yourself, sometime during or next to the Scrum sprints. Are the models developed in collaboration with the team itself? Sure. The team creates the process. That is what they do. It is not a big document of 500 pages about Scrum handed down by somebody else. It's just a few pages. The rest they have to come up with themselves. So pretty good score, I would say. As a complexity thinker, I think this is a good score. A few things that we have to watch out for, like don't be dogmatic about Scrum, and do some more experimentation, but that's about it. All right, some final words. Almost can be useful, some fail faster than others. That is my own variant on George Box's quote. I think all models are interesting, though some fail within minutes. Others still haven't failed me, but I still expect them to fail sometime. I like this one by Kurt Lewin. There's nothing as practical as good theory. So maybe you need to know a bit of the science before you really can come up with some very practical solutions, is the suggestion there. And Jerry Weinberg, don't take your models too seriously. Don't be too dogmatic in applying them. All right, so these are some of the books I read. I just have one reason for showing this, and that is to show off. Hope it works. Here are a few more. You can ask me for advice later on. People sometimes do. All right, that's the second topic. Maybe there are questions already. Does anyone have a question about this, or some comments about getting into a complexity mindset when trying to solve problems? No questions right now. Oh, I see one question over there.
It's not a question. I'm saying 3.0 is not actually an improvement of 2.0. It's something new. It was not explored in
Yeah. So if we use that metaphor, then you say 3.0 is actually a total rewrite from scratch, perhaps, of the organization, of the architecture.
You're right. It's looking at it from a different angle.
Okay.
It's more human.
A more human angle. Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I agree. I agree. Yeah. All right. Any other comments, questions? Yes.
Have you seen cultures, either personal culture or coming from a foreign country, where this model does not work?
Have I seen any cultures in other countries where this model?
Company cultures.
Well, that's a good question. I often get the question about cultures, geographical cultures, because I travel a lot, but I notice organizational cultures differ much more than geographical cultures, because an agile company in Shanghai is very much the same as an agile company in Europe or the US. I get exactly the same questions, like how do we work with distributed teams, how to work with a manager who keeps interrupting our sprints, etc., etc., etc. Same questions everywhere. The difference between different organizations, public sector versus commercial sector, banking versus media, etc., that can be much, much, much bigger. Or small entrepreneurial versus big corporate. And then your question is, does this apply somewhere less than elsewhere? I think no. The law of gravity applies everywhere. Same with self-organization. It exists. They are fundamental laws of complex systems. It doesn't matter if you're talking about big organizations or small ones. Of course, the outcomes and what emerges will be different. But hierarchies have also emerged as a result of self-organization. Governments have emerged as a result of how people self-organize in geographical areas. So it's the same. But what happens with those fundamental laws, that differs. Yeah. Right. Another question here.
Well, given the two presentations that you've done,
Yeah.
One thing is leadership missing in actually the skills of the team? First point. Second point, what skills does management need to obtain in order to become complex thinkers?
Okay. That's great questions. So question A, that is, what skills do the...
Is leadership missing?
Is leadership missing?
At an average level?
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes, yes. And I think if that is missing, then it is because it has been beaten out of the people. Because plenty of us are grown with innate leadership abilities, but they have to be cultivated. You have to live in an environment where leadership is stimulated. There's plenty of leadership on Twitter, where people obtain followers. That's leadership. If people want to follow you, then apparently you're a leader. That was, for me, the definition of a leader. We have that in organizations as well, where people say, well, let's introduce this technology, or let's do this kind of new agile practice. But in some organizations, it doesn't happen. Why not? I think because in the past they have been punished, perhaps, for being leaders. No. You're now taking over a manager's job. You're not a manager yet. You cannot do this. Perhaps that is the background. So I am positive towards human beings. I think plenty of us are leaders, maybe not everyone, we don't have to be, but plenty have leadership capabilities. And then the second part of your question is how do the management layers...
So essentially you're saying that in order to be real leaders, our management layers need to be able to be complex thinkers. How can that happen?
I think it has to grow over time. I think some managers of the current generation will never get it. I think some do, but that might be a minority. I think the new generations now grow up in such a way that they automatically get it. I I heard a story by someone just 2 weeks ago who tried to explain agile principles to his son or daughter or whatever, and the kid said, "That makes total sense. What is so new here?" That it's so obvious that this is the way you organize work, because with social networks and the cloud and the internet, everything that is available, the younger generations are used to self-organizing. They self-organize parties on the beach by just tweeting that it's going to happen, and then it happens. So they know about emergence, and they know you can steer it, and they know you need to have leaders. And then when these people end up in corporations, they might say, "What? I'm going to be bossed around by somebody who says that I am his subordinate? Are you kidding?" No way. So I think we can expect much more from the new generations.
So that means the way to change the world and to get to more agile management is just to wait?
Well, partly, yes. Yeah, but I think we can nudge it a little. And I think there's a lot that we can achieve on smaller scales. We can lead by example. We see plenty of people who now flock from boring organizations to great organizations. I just talked with someone who works now for Spotify in Stockholm, for example. Great example of an agile organization. They get all this. It's in their DNA. And people, the smartest software developers from all over the world flock to Stockholm to go work for Spotify, because they have an amazing workplace. They call their teams squads, and they call their community of practice guilds. And now they're growing bigger, and they're trying to prevent having business units, so they're having discussions. So what are we going to have? Will they be tribes or something like that? It's awesome when top management suggests these discussions and wants to ask from their employees, how do you think that we should organize things around here? So that's a great example. And we will see more and more of those kinds of businesses, I think. But it will take time.